after developing a body of work for over about a 5-year period, I came back to the studio after a couple of very big exhibitions and said, well, what's next? One of my favorite pastimes when I complete a project is to come back to the studio and clean up. So I was cleaning, and in the process I found a plastic bag that had some old textile fragments that are part of this large historic textile collection I have. Among them was a fragment of a Chinese silk tapestry. And I've had it for a long time. I kept taking it out of the bag and putting it away, never wanting to do anything with it. And this time I said, I'm going to kind of see what I can do with this. So I put some heat bonding on the back of it, and I simply cut away pieces that were in good shape. One of the interesting aspects of this, looking at this Chinese textile, is the fact that it reminded me about the fact that we are at such a distance from history. And I'm really excited about finding some sort of a link with the past. And through historic objects, they tell me about the moment in which they lived, as well as everything that happened, or some of the things that happened along the way as they survived into my own time. So in this case, what I did that I was so excited about was to take 6 pieces of drawing paper and attach a fragment from the original Chinese textile to each of those pages, and then play this game of exquisite corpse. Maybe you know what that game is all about, where you fold paper in 3 parts, somebody draws a head, and then you turn it over and somebody draws the torso of the body, and then somebody else draws the bottom part of the body, and then you open it up and see what the creature looks like. So in this case, what I did was to take the element and begin to extend it. And in each case, in each of these drawings, the goal was to find the spirit of something that existed within the fragment and to see how it could be enlarged upon, leading me to places or observations about imagery that I had never considered. So basically, this entire invention is something I could never have planned, never have anticipated. It simply evolved out of the process. I mean, I just love things like this. Here's a tail of a butterfly, another tail of a butterfly, and finding all of this between. And the whole idea that perhaps even in my drawing, I've captured some qualities that are related to the sensibilities of the original designer in China who produced this textile. I did 3 of these. I mounted them as books, as you can see here, and even did a few individual pieces, which all led me to the point of thinking, it's time to transfer all of this into an expression of textile. You know, coming to the studio and getting to work means kind of oftentimes looking at a source and thinking about how to develop it. What are the possibilities that are suggested here for a technical development in the work? Perhaps even leading me to do something that I hadn't done before in terms of a textile object. So, at one point, I don't even remember how or when this happened, it occurred to me, why not interpret these areas of color with tabs of fabric? And what I began to do was to sandwich together layers of textile with a felt core, which gives these some kind of weight and allows them to hold their shape. And then in a very mosaic-like approach, began to attach them to another fabric surface. As you can see, the light, as it moved off of these various surfaces of textiles constructed with diversity of ways, was really wonderful. There's canvas, there's satin, there are other kinds of weaves, And all of a sudden, that image started to come alive. I really like this guy. Look at him. Here, this is the original textile. You can see it's now has been photographically enlarged. And that textile had some clues which inspired this creature. I took the two tails of the butterfly, turned it into like a ballerina standing on point. And the whole thing becomes like a creature, maybe a creature with another one on its back. The kind of mystery of it is what really attracts me to it. I like to come back to it, to look at it. It looks at me as I look at it. I wanted to mention also the fact that there was an interesting challenge in asking how to respond to the original weaving that is here in the drawing. And one day it occurred to me photography was the perfect answer to this. So as you can see here, we made wonderful enlargements, which actually are read by many people as being actual weavings. And I let it be independent of the structure, of the textile structure, so that as time would go on, perhaps it would be an element that survived in time and be useful to somebody else. And therefore, like passing a baton in a relay race, we would be extending the impulse of the original Chinese textile into the 21st century and on beyond. After completing the large series of works, it seemed interesting to see if I could get some of that energy within a smaller work. And it happened one evening. I was leaving the studio and saw a tree next to my parked car, and it had a plastic bag in the branches, and I was reminded of that beautiful moment in the film American Beauty where the plastic bag takes on a life of its own. And it occurred to me, since I had elements of a tree in the original Chinese textile, why not build upon that and create a series of works called Things That Get Caught in Trees After a Storm. Once again, you can see here little hints at fragments that come off of the original textile are what generated all of this. Was exciting to do the series, and the greater intimacy within these pieces and change of scale also revealed something more in terms of the potential of the new technical approach that I was taking. In the first two series, I explored an extension of the imagery, and then I began to think a little bit more about the negative space, this beautiful blue field that is created by indigo dyeing very irregularly on very fine silk threads. I thought, is there a potential there? Is there something that I need to explore? So in looking at this area of negative space, I decided, how could I interpret it with these tabs of fabric that I'm using? And here you can see a series 1, 2, 3, 4 that were the first explorations of that negative space, a very impressionistic kind of approach to opening up that sense of blue, creating breathing space within the textile itself. Then by the time I got to this solution, something really wonderful happened. Here it was possible, for example, as you can see, to begin shaping this space, shape the negative space with the elements that defined it. And in addition to that, I also began to explore a little bit more about the edge of the textile. And if you look closely, you'll begin to see how richly those changes of color add to the dimensional quality of this textile surface. The last piece that I did in the series was the larger one, wherein I used this beautiful sweeping gesture here that was part of the original textile and began to discover a subject that could work in conjunction with it. Do you see it has kind of legs, and it has an eye, and it becomes kind of figurative. For some reason, I feel that it's a beautiful kind of presence that is evoked out of the depth of that blue surface and is coming to meet the gesture of the red element. The two of them are opposites, but they nicely complement each other in the work. A wonderful thing happened along the way. I contacted a friend of mine in New York, John Vollmer, who's an expert in Chinese textiles, just to get his impression about the origins of the textile that I'd been working with. He further told me an interesting thing about the piece, and that is that it was made in China, but it was never used there. He went on to explain that it was exported either to Manila or Macau, where it was picked up by Spanish ships and then taken to Portugal, of all places. Now you can imagine what it was like in a little Spanish vessel, wooden vessel, picking up Chinese silk, gorgeously woven textiles, and attempting to make that long journey, perilous journey, all the way to a client in Portugal who was waiting to use that textile for bed hangings and bed covers in a very elegant home. That story required me to react to it in some way, and that is the way in which I got to this piece that is called Flower Powered. I basically used a composition which came off of the original textile, but reinterpreted the blue areas as undulating seawater, included a subject in the lower area here which has the sense of something being transported to another place. I had to include something that suggested islands or a continent in the distance, in other words, the goal of the ship. And up above in the upper area, much in the way the images of angels are used in a lot of religious art, I included a flower which is again off of the original textile, but here floating in space, kind of as the spiritual goal of this very exciting journey. Finally, I don't think anyone can look at the piece without thinking about why are these gaps existing. The piece was made in a number of sections, as you can see, and in the process of assembling it after each was completed, I made the discovery of relating to a little box from China that I had as a child, wherein you slid one unit this way, another unit this way, drop one down on its side, which released a panel in the front and made it possible to open a drawer where I kept my precious silver dollars. I thought, why not incorporate that into this work? After a series of works were completed, I thought about them in exhibition, because that's the place where they leave the studio and go out for public viewing. And I remember back to my original textile with all of these elements that are kind of floating in space, and I thought to myself, how can I recreate that experience for the viewer? And it was at that point where I had the idea about inventing some of my own subjects that would float in my own space, in fact, in the space of the exhibition. Each one of the series developed independently. Each one incorporates a kind of different idea, a different approach to creating something that will exist in relationship to the total body of work. And as I'm thinking about them, an interesting word came to me, and that is the word mingling. Ming for Ming Dynasty, mingling as in to mingle with, to play in relationship with something. And that whole notion of, again, a kind of collapse in time through these objects, and then trying to take the spirit of the objects in the original textile, give them a life in my own, was the next kind of challenge. One other aspect of the Minglings, which I'm excited about, is to recognize the fact that although they look rather playful, there is a darker side to each of them. And that darker side has inspired me to define them as night flyers. These are creatures that fly over the sea at night. Perhaps they're the creatures that accompany the ship on its way to Portugal. And in that process, they carry with them a kind of spirit of determination, a spirit which I feel is so important, especially in this time in which we're living. We all know that life is very much about diverse kinds of approaches to every single subject we can think about. We're not thinking much about history, and I'm saying let's think about it. We're not thinking much about the consequence of a lot of our actions, and rash actions are leading us in very difficult territories these days. And I would like my minglings to exist as appearing to be free, but also carrying with them a kind of sense of accountability or responsibility as they find their role in the world at large. Go ahead. Remembering back to the first series of drawings that I did, I loved the composition in one of the first books and decided to use it as a kind of place to welcome some of the minglings into the composition. And so this was the first large piece that I did, utilizing this technique with the tabs and trying to create kind of a spatial situation in which the minglings appear to have kind of originated as a space beyond the plane and penetrated our own space. Because I was thinking about creating a new life in each of these minglings, I began to realize that I was kind of hybridizing, that they afforded me an opportunity to bring this and that together, to create something new with elements that did not know they were ever destined to be together. So that, of course, occurs with the fabric selection that I use, and it occurs with technique, and it occurs with drawing as I relate it to my original source of inspiration. But in this case, and in the case of some of the other pieces here, it also occurs as I'm thinking about fusing aspects from the insect world with the animal world, with the human world, with the world of floral objects. In that sense, the creatures begin to, for me, take on a very interesting life. In other words, they become kind of accompaniments to my own pleasure and my own process through their personalities. This one, I love the way that it reaches out. It seems to be holding balls, but are those balls or eyeballs? And is this a creature which is looking at itself from its exterior and discovering that the interior of the object is actually empty? Look at this one. Is it playing basketball? It certainly has a reference to feet that evolve into decorative elements that are drawn from details in my original drawings, and then coming through this hoop holding this orb. And that orb is what inspired this action here, which comes into these pieces. And I enjoyed very much, because I was feeling the original textile had lots of butterflies in it. I had to make something that looked like butterfly or floral or whatever. If you look closely, you'll find a figure there. And the figure is floating, suspended in space. And this is the male, this is the female. They're a pair. Where do the minglings live? I finally decided to do a series called Homecoming. This notion of a place that each of us finds ourselves centered, a place to be, a place that is quite wonderful in our own minds. I was making these 6 pieces, each one of which is focused on a single color and variations. And as I was working on them, I discovered relationship with the color palette in some of the minglings. And at one point I thought, why not consider this work as home base for this piece, that it finds a relationship here. When I thought about that, you know, what was so interesting is that I began to think in the history of painting about figure-ground relationships, which are so important in relationship to most of historic painting as we think about it. What I was doing, however, is establishing a figure in relationship to a ground, but now the figure is independent of it. And once you know where it exists, you can move this away into the next room, the room beyond that, the wall that is adjacent, away from the piece itself, and it will know what home base is. That sense of relationship also brings me closer to the original idea of connecting with the 17th century Chinese textile. I thought it would be of interest for the audience to have a reference to the original textile that was the inspiration for the entire series. So this is actually an enlargement, but in the form of a ghost image of that initial textile. What I hope everyone will be interested in doing is kind of examining details that exist within this piece in relationship to the art objects that I produced as a result of it. And you will find many correlations, many relationships that will tell you what the source of my response was.